Hello everyone, welcome to our class. Today we will talk about the Pthread interface. So how to write a program to create a new thread in your program. So we use Pthread interface. How to use it? So do you remember for a process, how to create a process? We use fork, right? So we can use a fork to create a process. So similar to a fork, we have a function to use to create the thread. It's called pthread created. So you will see every thread function is will start with pthread. So that's the reason we call it pthread interface. So you will see pthread created, pthread exit, pthread join, pthread detection. So we will see couple functions always start with pthread. If you see this pthread, means this is pthread family, the interface family, then you can use to deal with the thread. Okay, so let's look at how to create the thread here. Program. This is a program. Yes. So this is example how to create the thread. Actually, the pthread create need to take the first argument, which is a variable. So you pass a variable to store a thread ID. So yes, there's a thread ID. So you have a process ID. You can also have a thread ID. So process ID will be the same for all the thread in the same process. Because all the thread belong to the same process, they are not separate. They belong to inside the same process. So they share the same process ID. But for the thread, you need a way to identify which each thread ID it is. So which means you need to create a way to figure out what's the thread ID for each thread. So here for process, if we use process, we have fork to create the process. And we use get PID. We use get PID to get the process ID itself process ID, okay? So the fork can return the child process ID, right? Here we use pthread. Pthread will put the not child in a thread. We don't talk about child because thread is more like a peer. I create a new thread, not create a child because we should be equal. We belong to the same process. We should be equal. So it use this variable to get the child, not child, the peer. So it's use this variable to store the peer thread ID. Okay, so if inside the thread, if you want to get your thread ID, how to do it? You have another stuff called pthread self. So actually, the get PID and pthread self, you can see this is for process, this is for thread. Got thread ID and got process ID. And if you want to get the other process ID, you can use fork because fork return is child process ID. And for the thread, you can pass a variable into the first argument to store the thread ID for other thread. Okay, so this is the first argument. So the second one is an attribute. Usually we put null. It's just try to like set up what's the setting for the thread. And by default, we usually just give a null, which means we don't want to change the default setting for this attribute. So this is not an interesting one. The third one is really interesting one, which is a function. So actually, you pass a function just like a signal. You pass, you say a signal like which signal, which function you want to handle the signal. Here is the thing, which function you want to handle the thread. So you pass the thread function into this argument, and this thread function return type, return void star, and the argument is tag void star. So why is void star? Because imagine the void star is a pointer. It's pointer, so you can easily cast it the pointer to other stuff. If you want to pass an array, of course, use a pointer point to the first element in the array, right? If you want to you pass just an integer, of course, you make a pointer point to the integer. So actually, this void star, why we use void star? Because we don't know what's the return type for the function. We want to support every return type. We want to support every argument type. So we use a void star. Then when we use it, we do the casting. So this is the implementation like decide. they decide to use void star as an unknown type to support all type. If you want to use this type, you just do a casting into the void star. If you want to use a value you pass in, you just casting it back to the type you want to use. I will show you an example how to use this later. Okay, so the third one is kind of define function. A define function pass a function to this function name to this argument, then this thread will run this function. So when you create a thread, this thread is just run this function. So you don't need to create like an if-else statement to figure out which is child, which is parent, because there's no child and parents concept in a thread. So it's peer. So you just give a function to deal with this thread. So how to define a function? You just define it as a return type void, argument type void, which is defined, and pass a name into this argument. Then it will create a thread to run this function. Okay, so let's see the next one. This one is argument. So actually, this is an argument to pass into here. The argument passes into this function. So which means the argument is void star. It's matching to this type. Okay. So what's the argument you want to pass into the function to support this thread? This is something also very important, like a stuff you might want to like check when you call the Pthread credit. So in summary, how we create the thread? We use Pthread credit. We pass a function. What's a function? You need to handle this thread. So you pass this function into the Pthread credit. Then we pass an argument to support the function for this thread. We pass it in the fourth argument in the Pthread credit. And we store the thread ID into this variable. So your main thread can know like what's the thread ID for each of your peer thread. So this is like the summary of Pthread interface, how to create the thread. Okay, so this is a simple source code about the thread. Inside the source code, we have a main function. The main function defines the variable used to store the Pthread ID. Then inside here, we try to get the argument as the argument to pass to the thread. So we got the argument 1, and we convert it to an integer and assign to this argument because we want to pass this integer to the thread function. Then we have a return value. I am not going to use return value here right now, but we have a return value. So let's look at what happened here. Here we have a main thread. We just get the process ID of a main thread. Then we got the thread ID of the main thread. Okay. Then we use Pthread credit. Pthread credit, we pass the thread, the variable for the thread ID here, which is TID. And so it will store the thread ID, the peer thread ID, into this variable. Then a second one with null, which means we just use the default setting, default attribute, this default argument for this thread setting. Okay. The third one, we pass a thread. What's this? If you look at the thread here, actually we define a function. It's called thread. So we pass this function as a third argument. In this function, the return type is void start, and this argument type is also void start. Okay, so we pass this function as a third parameters into the Pthread credit. Then we pass the value we want to pass into this function, which is set argument. Okay, we pass the thread argument into this function. And of course, we need to cast it to a void star because the void star is the type for this function. The function, the parameter type of this function is void star. So we cast it to a void star and go to pass it into the Pthread credit. And after we credit, because we got the peer thread ID, so we try to print out a peer thread ID here. And notice that the TID, the Pthread ID, is an unsigned integer. So I do some casting of an unsigned integer, try to like cast it to integer to make sense. So we print out %u because we want to print the unsigned integer here. Okay, so this is the function we want to. So for this function, we try to get the argument, and for this argument, we just do the casting. because we pass the value, this value is void star. So we need to cast it, try to convert it back to an integer. So we assign this casting value as an integer to argument. So we print out the message hello from thread, then we print out this value. And also inside this thread, we try to get the PID, the process ID, and also we try to get its own thread ID. So this is the overview, like a general case to very, very simple case to generate a thread, just one thread. So let's see how it look like when it's run the system. Uh, so if we want to run the pthread, compile the pthread, we need to add dash pthread here. So remember, the compiler won't know what's a pthread interface if you don't put this dash pthread this option in your compiler. Okay, so you will say pthread thread hello thread hello .c -o. I want to give a name thread hello. Then I compile it. So after you compile it, you might see like a couple warning message, but it's okay. This warning message is talking about, oh, you have a really weird casting. You try to cast the integer to this void star. You try to cast a void star to integer. This is sounds like unusual. So do you want to still want to do that? This is just some warning message to help you to figure out, okay, this is something I should check. So after you review everything here, you will figure out, okay, this is totally fine because I want to do this casting. Okay, so in this case, you can ignore it. After you ignore it, you can try to run the program, which is thread hello, then you pass the argument, right? We try to pass the argument and make this argument pass to the thread function. So let's say we pass 15 and thread hello 15. So right now we can see what happened for your thread program. So inside this thread program, the main thread process ID is 544131. It's the same as your PS thread process ID, right? Actually, thread belong to the same process, so they have the same process ID. But the thread ID will be different. If you see the thread ID for your main thread and thread ID for your peer thread, it's totally different number. So actually, the thread has its own unique thread ID. It's not a process ID. And if you look at the thread ID here, your main thread can get the thread ID of your peer thread by store the value into a variable when you use pthread create this function. Okay, so in this example shows how you create the thread and how you talk to the thread. Actually, you can pass an argument, pass some like value to the thread function, and the thread function will get the value 15. You just like type, you just pass it into, it will print out this. So this is the idea how to create a thread. So this is for today's video. It's a short video, just give you a like briefly idea about how to create a thread in your program. Actually, you have a pthread created. This function is very similar to fork because fork can give you some child process ID. The pthread created also help you to figure out what's a peer thread ID by like saving the pthread ID into a variable. And how you create a pthread, how you like make your thread useful. You can pass a function for each different thread, and inside this function, you need to pass the argument, and the function can deal with anything. Of course, it can return some value. So this is about like the first example how to create a thread in your program. I hope you get it. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so we will talk about like other stuff like what's a zombie thread in the next video. I hope you will like enjoy it. But again, hope you enjoy this video first. Okay, so see you next time. Pthread interface is awesome.